On Friday, 5th December 1873, fire broke out in Boston, Massachusetts, the second in a year. The fire service sprang into action to prevent a repeat of the devastating city fire of 1872. Meanwhile, a young maid alighted from her carriage at a horse station, not far from where the fire was nearly extinguished. Bridget Lannergan, originally from Ireland, had emigrated to the United States, where she found work with a family at Mount Pleasant in the Dorchester area of the city. She walked quietly past them on the snow-covered ground, unaware that anyone was following her. She then became aware of footsteps crumping in the snow. As she turned round, she was hit over the head repeatedly with a club by a man. That man would turn out to be Thomas W. Piper. Piper had been born at Yarmouth in Nova Scotia in Canada on 22nd April 1849, the son of Thomas Piper, a farmer, and his wife Lydia. He trained as a carpenter and worked on the farm before deciding to move to Boston in 1866. He found work as a clerk in various businesses in the city and was hired as a sexton by the Reverend George Pentecost at the Warren Avenue Baptist Church. However, he had a kidney complaint which caused him a great deal of pain, so self-medicated with laudanum and alcohol. This caused him to hallucinate, and unknown to his employers, he started fires in the city before turning to murder. That fateful night of 5th December, Piper had been walking with his brothers to the church in Dorchester when he told them he wasn't feeling well and that he was going home. Instead of doing that, he purchased opium and had alcohol, taking all of it before he reached home. Once he reached his house, he took a saw and cut off a spoke of wood from a wheel, then hid it by a fence. Then the fire alarm sounded, and people came onto the street to watch the fire as it was being extinguished by the firefighters. Piper and his brother also went to look, and that was when he saw the young maid walking along the street. The brothers returned inside, and Piper told his brother that he was heading to bed, but instead he went to the kitchen, exited the house, and retrieved the wooden club he'd made. He began following Bridget, and did so for some time before he pounced at Columbia Street. He smashed her skull in, and by the time he stopped, she was dead. He was going to undress her, but became aware of people coming along the street, so scarpered. He climbed over a fence by the railway and took the long way home, discarding a knife that he thought could be identified as his as he ran, as well as the bloodied club. He'd used it to try and cut off her corset when he failed to pull it off. The young man ran after the culprit while his fiancée stayed with Bridget, but there was nothing she could do. Just as her fiancé was returning, a police officer arrived at the scene. Soon Detective Inspector John Ham arrived and told his men to follow the footprints while he took the statements of the young couple. When the police officers returned, they told him they'd lost the culprit due to all the heavy foot traffic in the snow at the railway, but they did say they'd found a night watchman who'd seen a man in a cape and hat at the yard. They also spoke to a young boy who was smoking a cigarette, hidden in the shadows, who was interrupted by the caped man. The man had held up his finger to his mouth for the boy to be quiet. The boy had nodded his head and never said a word. Soon the club and the knife were recovered. A number of men were arrested for the murder of Bridget, including Piper, but all were released as there wasn't enough evidence against any of them. An Irishman, Thomas Cahill, was questioned in relation to the case, as he and Bridget had been in a relationship, but there was no evidence to link him to her murder, and when he didn't find work, he returned to Ireland. However, Ham believed he was the prime suspect in the case. Sometime later, he received the news from the Irish police that Cahill himself had been murdered. In June 1874, Mary Tyner was making her way to her friend's house when she bumped into a stranger, Piper. He invited her into a tavern, taking her arm and telling her to sit down at one of the tables. He ordered a meal and a drink for her, but she refused. He added a white powder to the whiskey and tried to give her it again, but she insisted she didn't want it, so he drank it. After an hour, they left and went their separate ways. Mary continued on to her friend's house, then returned to her own apartment on Oxford Street, leaving the window open due to the heat, and fell onto her bed exhausted. Soon she was sleeping, but was woken up when she felt someone on her back. It was Piper. Using a small hammer, he struck her head several times. When she didn't alight the next morning, her landlady knocked on her door, and when there was no reply, opened it with her key, only to find the woman on the bed. An ambulance was called for, and she was rushed to the Massachusetts General Hospital, and although her life was saved, she was never the same again, and spent the rest of her life in asylums. On Sunday, 23rd May 1875, a 5-year-old girl, Mabel Hood Young, daughter of Charles and Helen Young, attended the Warren Avenue Baptist Church. She was a shy girl, but she knew Piper from his work at the church. Innocently, she pointed to the Belfry and asked, "What's up there?" Piper told her pigeons, and she asked to go up and see them. He said he'd take her after classes. The whole conversation was witnessed by the little girl's aunt, Augusta Hobbs, although she didn't hear what was said. After the classes finished, Miss Hobbs had a short meeting with the Reverend Pentecost and a few others, so while that was going on, Mabel went with Piper up to the Belfry. She was his final victim. At around 4 o'clock that afternoon, screams were heard coming from the Belfry from outside, so a man rushed into the church to report what he'd heard. When found by Walter Sawyer lying on the floor in her white dress, close to the trap door, she was still alive, although badly injured, with her head and face covered in blood. She succumbed to her injuries the following day. Meanwhile, the police were called, with Officer Dearborn arriving first, followed shortly after by Detective James Woods. News soon reached Dedham Street Police Station, where the now Assistant Deputy Chief Ham and Chief Edward Savage were stationed, and they too rushed to the scene. Ham immediately recognised Piper, and he was arrested. Blood was found on his clothes and on a handkerchief. He was remanded in Charles Street Jail until his trial, which began on Monday 6 December 1875, before Chief Justice Gray, which lasted 8 days. Piper's closing words to the jury were, "Gentlemen, I simply desire to say to you that I am innocent of this great crime laid to my charge. I did not murder Mabel Young." The jury couldn't agree, so Piper was retried on Monday 31st January 1876, this time before Justice Lord, assisted by Justice Colt. Although there wasn't enough evidence to convict him in the 2 other cases, he was found guilty of the murder of Mabel. He was sentenced to death and was hanged on Friday 26 May 1876. He was 27. He became known as the Boston Belfry murderer.